The snow had been falling on Millbrook since before dawn, transforming the small Yorkshire village into something from a Christmas card. Margaret Preston stood at her kitchen window, watching the flakes settle on the stone wall that bordered her garden. At 72, she'd seen countless winters, but this one felt different somehow. Perhaps it was the silence that came with the snow, or perhaps it was the weight of what she'd witnessed 3 days ago. The incident had shaken the entire village. It happened at the old Hartley farm, just beyond the hill where the oak trees stood like sentinels against the winter sky. Thomas Hartley, a widower in his late 60s, had kept to himself since his wife passed 2 years prior. The only companion he had was a German shepherd named Kaiser, a massive dog with a scarred muzzle and eyes that seemed to hold storms. People in the village spoke of Kaiser in hushed tones. The postman refused to deliver to the farm. Children crossed to the other side of the lane when they passed the property. Margaret had heard the stories. Kaiser had bitten a man from the electric company. He'd lunged at Mrs. Cooper's terrier, nearly killing the poor thing. Thomas kept him chained in the yard most days, and the dog's barking echoed across the valley like a warning. But 3 days ago, everything changed because of a little girl named Emma. Emma Barnes was 7 years old, visiting her grandmother in Millbrook for the Christmas holidays. She had curly auburn hair that bounced when she walked, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Her grandmother, Dorothy Barnes, lived 2 houses down from Margaret and had warned the child repeatedly about the Hartley farm. "You stay away from that place, Emma," Dorothy had said firmly. "That dog is dangerous. Everyone knows it." Margaret had been in Dorothy's sitting room for tea when she'd overheard the warning. She'd nodded in agreement, remembering the time she'd seen Kaiser straining against his chain, teeth bared when a delivery van had come too close. The morning of the incident, Margaret had been walking back from the village shop, her boots crunching through fresh snow, when she'd heard the screaming. It came from the direction of the Hartley farm. Her heart hammered as she quickened her pace, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Other villagers had heard it too. By the time Margaret rounded the bend in the lane, a small crowd had gathered at a safe distance from Thomas Hartley's gate. And there, in the snowy yard, was a scene that would haunt Margaret's dreams. Emma Barnes had somehow slipped away from her grandmother and wandered to the farm. The gate had been left ajar. Thomas later said he'd been bringing in firewood and hadn't latched it properly. The little girl had walked right into the yard, and Kaiser, free from his chain for the first time in months, had been standing in the center of the space. "Someone call emergency services!" shouted Robert Chen, the village shopkeeper, his phone already in his hand. "Dear God, that child," whispered Mrs. Cooper, her face pale. Thomas Hartley stood on his front step, frozen in horror, his firewood scattered at his feet. His voice was hoarse as he called out, "Emma, don't move! Please, sweetheart, don't move." Dorothy Barnes was running up the lane, her coat flapping open, terror etched on her face. Emma, come here right now." But Emma wasn't moving. She wasn't running. She wasn't screaming. She was standing perfectly still in the falling snow, looking at Kaiser. The dog stood 10 feet away from her, his massive head lowered, his body tense. Everyone could see it, the way his muscles were coiled, the way his ears were pinned back. This was a dog ready to attack. This was the aggressive, dangerous animal they'd all been warned about. "Emma, listen to Grandma," Dorothy called, trying to keep her voice steady, though tears streamed down her face. "Walk backwards very slowly. Come to Grandma." The little girl didn't seem to hear, or perhaps she chose not to listen. Margaret watched, her hand pressed to her chest as Emma did the unthinkable. She took a step toward Kaiser. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. Thomas Hartley lurched forward but stopped, knowing any sudden movement might trigger the dog. "No, sweetheart, no," Dorothy sobbed. Emma took another step, her small boots leaving prints in the pristine snow. And then she did something that made Margaret's blood run cold. She reached out her hand. "She's going to touch him," Margaret whispered. "Dear Lord, she's going to touch him." Kaiser's lips had been curled back, showing teeth. His whole body had been rigid with what everyone assumed was aggression. But as Emma's small hand extended toward him, something extraordinary happened. The dog's ears came forward, The tension in his shoulders eased. His tail, which had been tucked low, lifted slightly. Emma's fingers made contact with the top of Kaiser's head. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then Kaiser did something nobody expected. His massive body sank down into the snow. He lowered his head further, pressing it into Emma's small palm. A sound came from him, not a growl, but a whimper. A soft, broken sound that carried across the silent yard. Emma smiled. Her voice was clear in the winter air. "You're not mean. You're just sad, aren't you?" She sat down in the snow, right there in front of the dog everyone feared, and wrapped her small arms around his neck. Kaiser leaned into her embrace, and his whole body began to shake. He was crying, Margaret realized with a shock. The dog was crying. Thomas Hartley's legs seemed to give out. He sat down hard on his front step, his face in his hands. The crowd stood frozen, watching as this little girl held a supposedly vicious dog while snow continued to fall around them, settling on her auburn curls and on Kaiser's dark fur. "I lost someone too," Emma said softly to the dog, her voice barely audible. "My grandpa died last year. Grandma says it's okay to be sad. It's okay to miss people." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. She wasn't alone. All around her, the villagers who had gathered to witness a tragedy were instead witnessing something else entirely. Dorothy Barnes finally moved forward, slowly, carefully, but when she reached her granddaughter, she didn't pull her away. Instead, she knelt in the snow beside Emma and reached out her own trembling hand to touch Kaiser's head. The dog looked up at her with those storm-filled eyes, and Dorothy saw what her granddaughter had somehow known all along. This wasn't aggression. It was grief. It was loneliness. It was the desperate pain of a creature who had lost his person and didn't know how to express it except through the only language he had left. Thomas Hartley finally made his way over, moving slowly, as if in a dream. He knelt beside them all, and when Kaiser looked at him, the old man broke down completely. "I'm sorry," he said to the dog, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry, boy. I've been so lost without her that I couldn't see you were lost too. I chained you up because I didn't know what else to do. I thought you were angry, but you were just hurting, weren't you? Just like me." He pulled Kaiser close, and the dog pressed against him, finally being held by the person he needed most. The crowd began to disperse quietly, each person carrying away something profound they couldn't quite put into words. Margaret walked home slowly through the snow, her mind full of what she'd witnessed. In the days that followed, the village began to see Thomas and Kaiser differently. The chain came down. Thomas could be seen walking Kaiser through the village, the dog calm and gentle at his side. Children who had once crossed the street now stopped to pet him. Kaiser bore their attention with patience, though Margaret noticed he seemed to watch for a particular little girl with auburn curls. Emma visited the farm every day of her holiday, and Margaret often saw her sitting with Kaiser in the snow, talking to him about everything and nothing. Sometimes Thomas would join them, and the three would sit together as the winter afternoon faded to evening. On Christmas Eve, Margaret bundled up against the cold and made her way to the village church for the candlelight service. The church was full, the ancient stone walls glowing with warmth from dozens of candles. She slid into a pew near the back and was surprised when Thomas Hartley sat down beside her, Kaiser lying quietly at his feet. "They said I could bring him," Thomas said softly, seeing her expression. "Vicar said any creature who teaches us about love belongs in God's house." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Across the aisle, she could see Emma sitting with her grandmother, the little girl's face bright with candlelight. The child caught Kaiser's eye and waved. The dog's tail thumped once against the stone floor. As the service began and the familiar carols filled the air, Margaret thought about fear and innocence, about how adults build walls that children somehow know to walk through. Everyone had warned Emma not to touch the aggressive dog. They'd seen danger where she'd seen suffering. They'd seen a threat where she'd seen a soul in need of comfort. Perhaps, Margaret thought, that was the gift of innocence, not that it was naive or foolish, but that it saw clearly what experience had taught them to overlook. Emma hadn't ignored the warnings because she was reckless. She'd ignored them because she'd looked into Kaiser's eyes and recognized something everyone else had missed. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing Millbrook in white. Inside the church, voices rose in harmony, singing of peace and goodwill. And at Thomas Hartley's feet, a dog who had been called aggressive rested his scarred muzzle on his paws, finally at peace. After the service, as people filed out into the snowy night, Margaret paused beside Thomas. "How is he really?" she asked, gesturing to Kaiser. Thomas smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face in 2 years. "He's teaching me how to live again," he said simply. "That little girl gave us both a second chance." Emma appeared then, her grandmother close behind. She knelt beside Kaiser and kissed the top of his head. "Merry Christmas, Kaiser," she said. Then she looked up at Thomas. "Mr. Hartley, could I come visit during Easter holiday too? Grandma says we might come back." "I'd like that very much," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Kaiser would too. As Margaret walked home through the silent, snow-covered streets, she thought about the story she would tell, about how a little girl had saved both a man and a dog simply by refusing to believe what everyone told her to believe, by trusting what her heart showed her instead. The snow had stopped falling, and the stars were coming out, brilliant against the black sky. Somewhere behind her, she could hear laughter, Emma's bright voice and Thomas's deeper rumble, and beneath it, the sound of Kaiser's happy barking as he bounded through the snow with the little girl who had seen past everyone's warnings to the truth underneath. In the morning, Margaret knew there would be fresh snow. The village would wake to a clean, white world, transformed and new. But the real transformation, she thought, had already happened. It had happened in a farmyard 3 days ago when innocence met pain and chose love instead of fear. That was the gift Emma had given them all, not just to Kaiser, not just to Thomas, but to everyone who had watched and learned that sometimes the warnings we give, the walls we build, the fears we harbor, sometimes they blind us to the very thing we most need to see. Sometimes the most dangerous thing we can do is not to reach out, but to hold back. Margaret let herself into her cottage and stood again at her kitchen window, looking out at the snow-covered garden, at the stone wall, at the world made new. Tomorrow, she would bake biscuits and take them to Thomas and Kaiser. Tomorrow, she would start breaking down some walls of her own. But tonight, she simply stood in the warm glow of her kitchen, grateful beyond measure that a little girl had been brave enough to touch what everyone said not to touch, to love what everyone said could not be loved, and in doing so, had reminded them all what it meant to be human.